started the recording. So this webinar is now being recorded for our YouTube channel. I also should mention that this whole webinar series has been amplified in reach by a partnership with the Emerald Ash Borer University, which is currently managed by Purdue University. So if you go to the Emerald Ash Borer University page on emeraldashborer.info, you will find all 6 webinars, titles, links, and within about the next week, you will also find all the recordings and the Don't Move Firewood EAB Week 2024 webpage will have all of the PowerPoints that we received authorization to share in PDF formats. I see folks are really getting into the chat of showing where they're from, so that's fantastic. Thank you, everybody. We got folks from Texas to Western Canada, Montana, Oregon, Sacramento, which is in California, Indiana, more Texans, Kentucky, so many people. With that, I'm hopeful that Laurel has got the PowerPoint. Still no. Oh gosh. It's always something with Zoom. This new format has been a little tricky, and I'm sorry to everybody for the technical difficulties. Where are we at, Laurel?
You're doing amazing with giving us a couple minutes here. Yeah, I'm still just waiting on, yep, he's got the right email. I'm just still haven't gotten the slides yet, which I mean, it might be a large file, so it might be taking a minute or two.
Okay.
I'm just like refreshing over and over.
Classic webinar moment. If something can go wrong with Zoom, it will. Well, I mean, that's life. So, Max, I don't know if you want to introduce yourself while Laurel is frantically refreshing her email, or what would be your preference? I'm sure we'll get this working in a moment here. So if everybody could just bear with us, we'll figure it out.
Thank you for your patience, everyone.
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm Max Ragozzino from Oregon Department of Agriculture. I am a biocontrol entomologist working on emerald ash borer response. And I'm so sorry for the technical difficulties.
Max, Laurel just looks like maybe she got it working.
Okay.
Yes, I did. And I'm downloading it now and pulling it up. Look at that.
There we go.
Thank you so much.
No problem. So Lee, if you can stop sharing, and then I'll share my screen and we can get going. Thank you so much, everyone, for your patience.
Yeah, thanks, everybody. It's a very Friday afternoon kind of problem for a Wednesday afternoon.
Yes. So.
All right. How's that look?
That looks perfect.
Okay, wonderful. Then yeah, you can just tell me like next slide each time.
Yeah, so sorry, it's gonna be real old school with next slide. And yeah, so I'm here to give an update on our emerald ash borer infestation and response. So we can go on to the next slide. So first of all, a little bit about Oregon and its ash. It is a little different from some of the eastern and midwestern states with EAB, in that Oregon has an endemic species of ash, the Oregon ash, Fraxinus latifolia. It is unfortunately fully susceptible to EAB and has been shown to be a competent host of emerald ash borer. EAB can reproduce and kill Oregon ash. That was originally proven in common garden experiments and confirmed in Forest Grove. Oregon ash is endemic to the westernmost region of the Pacific Northwest, stretching down into Northern California a little bit, but then up into all the way up into Canada. 80% of Oregon ash grows below 1,000 feet of elevation. So we are really looking at this highlighted area as where Oregon ash is threatened. Next slide. And before I go on to our response in full, I have to thank everyone who's made it possible. On the initial slide, you saw 3 names at ODA who are working on this. There are so many people who have made our response possible. Our on-the-ground cooperators, our local, state, and federal partners have made our response possible. Some shout outs are Clean Water Services and Oregon Metro. Clean Water Services is our local water utility, who have a prerogative to keep surface water temperatures down, and thus they were really tuned into EAB as a threat. Oregon Metro is a regional government agency that manages a lot of similar properties, as well as the State Department of Forestry, USDA Forest Service, USDA APHIS, the city, county, and local governments, as well as the Soil Water Conservation District for Tualatin, the region that our infestation is in, have all been crucial for making on-the-ground connections with landowners, stakeholders, and decision makers in order to make a real response possible. Next slide. So, talking about all the people that have made it possible, what have we actually done? This is a very brief overview of the timeline of where we started and where we are today. Some of you may have heard the news of an Oregon dad detecting EAB, and that is true. But that Oregon dad was a City of Portland forester. So he was dropping off his kid at summer camp and in Forest Grove, and noticed that the ash trees in the parking lot looked really bad, and sure enough, there were EAB emerging out of them. That was on June 30th, and by the end of the 4th of July weekend, we had 16 infested trees cut and chipped, and were hitting the ground running. Over the course of July, we got the Oregon EAB Task Force created. So like any good government agency, we created a committee with many subcommittees, and began visual surveying. You'll see more about that in the next couple of slides. By December, we had a temporary quarantine in effect, prohibiting the spread of ash wood outside of Washington County. By February, USDA was leading an interagency workshop to teach us how to better identify EAB. By April, we were beginning our slow ash mortality projects. By June, we're into biocontrol. So within 1 year, we really ramped up our response. After that 1-year anniversary, we started to fell our slam trees, really get on the ground data, and now we're pretty much to today. Next slide. So our initial on the ground response consisted of a couple of different factors, one of which was visual survey. We coordinated this through Survey 123 instead of the good old paper forms in order to really be able to see live data. We, of course, went down the legislative route of establishing a quarantine. An emergency quarantine went into effect almost immediately, and a more permanent quarantine went into effect sometime later. The Oregon Department of Forestry and USDA APHIS coordinated trapping with purple prism and green funnel traps. We immediately got in touch with our amazing colleagues at the USDA Brighton lab, working on biocontrol to make sure we were able to get releases. And then, of course, we started to remove and treat infested trees and work on SLAM. Next slide. So visual surveys are critical for detecting EAB, albeit they are difficult as well. Trapping is not as effective for EAB as it is for some of our other pests like spongy moth or Japanese beetle. Trapping is a little trickier. So visual surveys are an effective way to find infestations of EAB. You've been hearing that through this whole webinar series. If any of you are curious about and want to see how our visual survey data looks today, you can find that at oda.fyi/ash-dash, and that'll bring the EAB dashboard up for you. To date, we've done almost 10,000 surveys. Not all of those are reflected in the dashboard, but most of our infestation, or most of our survey and infestation occurs within Washington County. The downside of a visual survey is it is very time consuming, and trees need to be infested for at least 2 years before symptoms are really evident. But a huge plus of this is that it helps create an inventory of all of our ash trees in and around the infestation. We chose to use Survey 123 as our surveying tool because we had a lot of partners on the ground who don't have ArcGIS Online licenses. So we wanted to be able to have those, tap into those trained eyes on the ground without, having to have them utilize pay for an expensive license. Next slide. So hopefully you all have seen these signs and symptoms on other presentations through the webinar series, but to briefly go over it, when you're doing a visual survey for EAB, you're looking for thinning crowns, epicormic shoots, woodpecker blonding, or woodpecks, either from like pileated woodpeckers stripping the bark or from woodpecks going after the larvae themselves. You're, of course, looking for bark splits, in particular short bark splits that have serpentine galleries underneath, although those aren't always visible. And of course, if you happen upon a 3 millimeter diameter D-shaped exit hole, that is always a guaranteed sign, at least in Oregon, that you have an emerald ash borer. For us, we don't have any other buprestids that hit ash. And of course, the telltale sign, if you take a strip of bark off the tree, if you see serpentine galleries, you have an emerald ash borer. Next slide. So I mentioned oda.fyi/ash-dash. If you'd like to check it out, this is what you'll see. A series of points. Each diamond represents a surveyed tree with some management status overlaid, as well as the known infested area highlighted. Right now, we have a relatively low percent infestation, but of course, that doesn't account for the fact that we know EAB is already into some natural areas where we know we're not going to be able to remove all of the infested trees. So orange and red dots indicating positives, yellows indicating suspect trees where we haven't confirmed EAB, but we're seeing signs and symptoms, and then gray dots being an otherwise healthy appearing tree. Next slide. So one of our most legislative actions that we took as a state agency, it was the quarantine. This prohibited the transport of untreated ash material outside Washington County, including nursery stock. There are acceptable treatments, including chipping and heat treatment for wood material, as well as screenhouse growing or insecticide treatments for nursery stock. This accounts for all of the known hosts of emerald ash borer, ash, and olive and white fringe tree. Olive and white fringe tree are known hosts of emerald ash borer, albeit less viable than ash, although very high bar on for ash as a suitable host. A permanent quarantine went into effect in December 2023. And if you are a grower in Washington County or the surrounding area and want to know more, please reach out. My contact info will be at the end of the presentation. I can get you in touch with the right people. Next slide. For trapping, that was handled primarily by the Department of Forestry and USDA APHIS. They coordinated a network of traps and agencies who were able to put time towards setting and checking traps. Traps and lures were provided by USDA. Both purple prism and green funnel traps are baited with Z3 hexanol. And hung in ash trees 5 miles or further from Forest Grove. The traps are really a detection methodology to find new and to look for new infestations. They are checked every 2 weeks, starting in April through October. In 2023, 153 traps were set by ODF, USDA, and all of our coordinating partner agencies. And our goal for 2024 is to up that number to 200 total, 200 new traps set in 2024. Some of these traps were set as far out as Portland. These were set pretty far and wide in order to detect new, really high risk areas. Next slide. So one of this is where I come into play in most of this project, is with the biological control of emerald ash borer. We are utilizing 3 of the 4 biocontrol agents based off climatic matching, 1 egg parasitoid, Oobius agrile, and 2 of the larval parasitoids, Spatheus galeni and Triascus planopenesi. All of these are classical biocontrol agents from EAB's native range. They co-evolved with EAB, heavily tested for host range and efficacy, and these are determined not to be a risk to North America's native beetles. Oobius agrile shuts down EAB's life cycle earliest, preventing any damage from being done by parasitizing the egg, although it is the smallest of them and therefore spreads the slowest, just because their body size is very small. Spatheus and Tetrastychus are much larger, and larval parasitoids, they can have Spatheus can have up to 12 offspring per EAB, with Tetrastychus having upwards of 45, and are significantly larger, and can spread a little farther. Next slide. So here in Oregon, biocontrol releases began in June of 2023 and ran through early September. In 2023, we released 3,800 Oobius agrile, 1,800 Spatheus galeni, and 3,300 Tetrastychus planopenesi. In the picture on the right, you can see one of the ubinators, which is the method for releasing Oobius. Within that orange pill vial are infested EAB eggs with screen mesh over the bottom opening so that they can crawl out and go over to the tree and find EAB eggs. On the picture on the left, you can see is the way we release Spatheus and Tetrastychus. Those infested logs are hung. They're infested with EAB that are then parasitized and then hung to release as they develop and are ready to go. In 2023, we had 2 release sites, but in 2024, we will actually have 4 total sites. And we can go to the next slide. So obviously a big effort here is removal and treatment. In 2023, ODA worked with the city of Forest Grove to remove 60 infested ash trees across the city. Initially, we began that homeowners were notified by mail and door knocking that either a confirmed or highly suspected EAB positive tree was on their property. They had to apply through the city to be removed. Primarily, these were street trees or trees on private property, but also 2 parks in Forest Grove had trees removed through this process. In 2024, funding came through from the U.S. Forest Service and the Department of Forestry, Oregon Department of Forestry, to help remove an additional 35 trees from a highly infested residential neighborhood, and 45 trees from an abandoned rail spur that had heavy infestations. Phase 2 of that project will be to replant those residential trees with biodiverse alternatives, which was part of the funding, so that hopefully when the next invasive pest comes in, it does not wipe out every single street tree. Homeowners applied to be a part of this program. Next slide. So a couple before and after images in Oregon. Obviously, anyone who's seen an EAB infestation has seen this before. Right in the same location, it looks night and day. The difference between a row of mature ash trees and a sunny parking lot is really striking. Next slide. So on to SLAM. SLAM standing for slow ash mortality. We know that eradication is nearly impossible. We are the 36th state to deal with emerald ash borer, and we've seen 35 states attempt eradication. So instead of trying to eradicate, we are trying to slow the spread and mitigate the population as much as possible. We are going to try to use area-wide integrated pest management in order to reduce the number of beetles spreading so that we can have conversations like this with more stakeholder groups and educate municipalities outside Forest Grove that they need to be ready and have a plan of action for when that happens. Next slide. So in order to implement SLAM, we did a SLAM ring. We worked with Nate Siegert of the Forest Service to create a ring of, to plan a ring of infested, or a ring of trap sites around the EAB infestation. Emerald ash borer are heavily attracted to the phenols and volatile compounds emitted from a dying ash tree. And there's no better way to do that than to girdle a tree. So each SLAM site received 1 girdled tree and 1 to 3 treated trees, the blue painted tree next to it. The idea being that we can limit how many EAB adults are flying past this SLAM ring, and then the insecticide treatment of emamectin benzoate kills any EAB that feed on the treated trees. And then by felling the girdle tree, we can determine where the population is spreading by debarking them, and then also killing any of the beetles that landed on that tree by the debarking and incineration. Next slide. So this is our initial SLAM ring. The city of Forest Grove and Cornelius are centered on this map, and each dot represents a tree. We selected 113 sites, about 1 every quarter mile, in a circle approximately 1 to 4 miles from the known infestation epicenter, because we knew that EAB was probably a little further out than we were detecting through visual surveys. Our partners on the ground that I mentioned on the second slide of this talk, Clean Water Services, Metro, and especially our local Tualatin Soil Water Conservation District, were crucial in getting approval from landowners and land managers. A lot of some of these properties were owned by Clean Water or Metro or managed by them, but many of them are private properties that are volunteering to be a part of this effort. Next slide. So 2023's SLAM effort, ODA staff started marking trees in March and April. We started girdling those trap trees in May in order to basically leave them in a state of dying across as long of the EAB's emergence time as possible. Treatment started in June and went through into early July, at which point some of our trees needed to be re-girdled. We'll have a picture of that on the next slide, where the Oregon ash is actually starting to regrow over the girdle. Girdled trees were felled and sampled in October and November. The treated trees are left standing, and you'll see in the next slide, the next couple slides, what we did with any of the trees where we had positive detections. So we can go on to the next slide. So you can see on the picture on the left, we have some girdled tree that actually on the left you can see is growing callus tissue over the girdle, which is wild. Some of our ash trees that we selected, or the only trees at the sites, were behind mountains of invasive wild Himalayan blackberry. So lots of difficult times getting to some of these trees, but ultimately it was worth it. On the picture on the right, you can see just how quickly a ash tree declines on the right when girdled versus left or treated with a chemical with the insecticide on the left. Next slide. So in the fall of 2023, all of our girdled trees were felled, and 3 1-meter long samples were taken from the tree, from each tree at the base, middle, and canopy. Each sample was marked with a unique tree identifier and sample number, and then taken to a barn to be debarked. Next slide. Thank you. So when the trees were felled, we ended up basically going through, collecting those, and then leaving the remainder of the tree on site. Any of our trees that were negative for EAB, we left on the ground or removed if the homeowner wanted or the landowner wanted. But most want the snag habitat. Hauling those trees off site and storing them to be debarked later. We can go to the next slide. Each one of those sections of tree were debarked, and the EAB were recorded in a survey 123 form for the sake of data retention. Debarkers recorded any EAB galleries that they saw, be it old galleries, galleries with exit holes, galleries that ended with woodpecker damage, the age class of each larva, and whether, and especially, fresh galleries that ended in an EAB larva. We can go to the next slide. Some of the you can see our picture of our setup here. The dead of winter with some propane heaters. The EAB you can see an EAB gallery here where the beetle ate over its gallery when it went to pupate, and sure enough, digging in with the chisel, you can find a prepupa right beneath the right in the sapwood. Next slide. So obviously, not every plant survives contact with reality. In spring of 2023, we believed we had 2.2 square miles known to be infested, which is highlighted in red here. You can go to the next slide. So we planned our slam ring accordingly. Each one of these gray points represents one of our 113 slam trees that we girdled and implemented in the summer. Next slide. But by fall of 2023, more survey results came in. Some of our early trapping results popped up, and it turns out we actually had 5.7 square miles known to be infested. For the most part, our slam ring was on point. Our predictions were not far off. The one issue was the northern stretch of the infestation. It turns out that the Council Creek area that we thought was not yet infested was actually on the inside of the infestation, a little heavier infested than we thought. Next slide. So when we debarked and counted our slam ring, you can see those results of any of our positive catches here. For the most part, we only caught our slam ring caught beetles, or excuse me, our slam ring caught trees with a very small number of beetles. 1, 2, 3, or 4 beetles per tree are not a lot of EAB in a single girdled ash tree. Closer to the known infestation, like in our south point on the Zerker property, we had 21, or sorry, we had 2 in 1 and another in 1, but in Fernhill Wetlands, we had a catch with 13. But our high point on the Council Creek side, on the north side of Forest Grove, had a high of 38, which is pretty high level of EAB in a single girdled tree. We can go on to the next slide. So after our debarking, with all of that knowledge, we now know that we have around 10.4 square miles known to be infested, which really puts us at a strong point to move forward into the 2024 season with the knowledge that we think we have close to the edge of the infestation known. We have very low infestations at this perimeter site, so we think we can take a good management action this upcoming year with this knowledge. Next slide. So a quick breakdown, you can see the life stage here. I kind of glossed over this in the previous slide, but most of those beetles you can see highlighted in the purple and green are early or late instar, meaning they are larvae that were laid in 2023. Only at the Fernhill Wetlands and Council Creek site did we find old galleries indicating a 2 or longer year infestation. Next slide. So we're on to what are we doing in 2024? We have 3 types of sites. We have our sink sites, our slam sites, and our sentry sites. Our sink sites are within the center of the infestation. We are going to select sites that are well within the infestation zone, girdled trees in order to draw beetles into the site so that they're not leaving and dispersing outward. We have 3 large sites selected with 3 to 4 girdled trees per site and 9 to 16 treated trees. We have an additional 5 small sites with only 1 or 2 girdled trees per site, but 3 to 8 treated trees within each one of those. We're going to return to those sites and hopefully girdle new trees come 2025 to continue the sink and kill effort. Our slam ring is a little different than last year. Because of the detected spread and density of EAB, we're going to try to change our targets a little bit, but we're going to try to limit how many can cross the slam ring. Our target this year is about 30 miles of slam with 1 girdled and 2 treated trees every quarter mile along the ring. And finally, we're adding sentry trees outside of the slam ring. These are low odds, high risk areas. These are where if we find a new EAB detection, we have to wildly change our plans. It's low odds, but we want to check because we want to make sure we're catching any spread. Our 2024 target is about 31 miles of sentry girdled trees along waterways, and we're girdling approximately 1 every mile. Our goal is to girdle 175 total ash trees this year, new trees, and treat an additional 300 from last year. And then we can move on to the next slide. So you can see a map here of Forest Grove with our sink, slam, and sentry sites. Sink is in the blue highlighted areas. You can see some of those are really in the center of Forest Grove. Moving outward, we have our slam sites around that in a slightly modified ring. and then our sentry sites stretching out from there. Next slide. So obviously for this group, how did I know everyone wants to know how emerald ash borer got to Oregon, and I don't think we'll ever know for sure what vector actually brought it, but I can say with enormous confidence that it was human-aided spread. Firewood is a likely vector, but other raw wood materials are possible. Obviously, I don't need to tell this group, don't move firewood, but don't move firewood. Other vectors do include, though, older untreated, potentially untreated wood material. A pet peeve of mine, or a pet risk pathway of mine, is raw or live edge wood material. Raw wood material from is just something that's getting popular, and it could be a vector. Of course, there's always other avenues as well, but don't move firewood. Next slide. So emerald ash borer, I know some of you maybe have heard this earlier in the this webinar series, but EAB spreads relatively slow, but it can spread fast. Or as a population, EAB spreads relatively slow within a site, but individuals can spread very far. Less than 1% of, about 1% of mated females flew greater than 500 meters. Some flight mill studies show that they could fly up to 5 kilometers a year. Dendrochronology shows that the infestations actually spread around 4 kilometers a year with, this is all relatively, reasonable rate of spread for a new invasive pest, but we're really talking about human mediated spread. Next slide. So I'm going to try something bold. I've got a video embedded. If you can click play, it should be in the bottom left. This is a video from USDA APHIS of the infested counties over time. So you can see, starting since EAB was initially detected, new counties are popping up rapidly, spreading across the country at a rate far, far greater than even the maximum of 15 kilometers a year of spread. So you can see as EAB spreads, it makes pretty big jumps across whole states. Next slide. That shouldn't. Yep. So, okay. So some back of the napkin math. If we assume, so EAB spread with people from 2002 to 2013, from Detroit to Denver is around 2,000 kilometers, or 1,250 miles. That's about 182 kilometers a year, an order of magnitude faster than their natural spread. Next slide. If we assume that EAB spread straight from Detroit to Forest Grove, that's about 3,200 kilometers, or about 160 kilometers a year. Again, an order of magnitude and a half greater than their natural spread. Next slide. And if we assume they had a layover in Denver, then it's 178 kilometers a year. All that being said, this is, regardless, tenfold faster than their natural spread. So again, preaching to the choir here, don't move firewood. Next slide. And with that, I'll take any questions. My contact info is here, as well as Matt Mills, who's our EAB survey coordinator, who is out in the field today working on girdling trees and getting ready for treatments.
Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you so much, Max. I'm going to check the Q&A here. It looks like we do have a question. And again, just to remind folks, it's a lot easier for us to keep track of questions in the Q&A feature. So if you have any questions for Max, make sure to put it up in there. Okay, so Patrick Porter says, I read that a quarantine Oregon County included ash, white fringe tree, and olive in the quarantine. Do you have any feel for whether EAB will infest olive in the wild? The Cipollini et al. Paper from 2016 was the last mention for olive that I have found.
Yeah, Patrick. Wonderful question. So unfortunately, Oregon is at the relatively cutting edge as far as olive industry with EAB infestation. I believe Georgia also has a bit of a budding olive industry. But it is like some of the other folks have answered previously, it is highly limited information, but we are working with University of Delaware and actually Cipollini on getting more answers to that. Oregon State University is really invested in determining whether or not there's any mechanisms of resistance in olive are for EAB and all of that other amazing, interesting work. We know from
Max, I have a quick, oh, sorry, go ahead.
We know from Cipollini's work that olive is a potentially viable host. EAB did emerge from olive in their work, and we have no reason to doubt that. So we are including olive in the quarantine for that as a risk.
Yeah, so I'll add too, because if you look in the answered Q&A, Patrick asked a similar question during one of our earlier webinars, which was great. And I actually did a little quick research because I had read a review by some Ukrainian scientists about the spread of emerald ash borer in Europe, which is also not part of its native range. It's primarily infesting Fraxinus excelsior there, which is European ash. In Europe, the emerald ash borer infestation has not yet reached where they grow culinary olives. Just physically, it's not there yet. Much like in the United States, the emerald ash borer has not yet reached where we typically grow olives, but it's getting closer every day. So I did send a citation to Patrick and anybody else interested in the state of olive research. You can look it up in the answered Q&A right now. That is essentially the best we've got, because until emerald ash borer begins infesting the areas around olive groves, and specifically too, I'll mention, I learned this yesterday. There's two types of olives in the world. There's the ones grown in China that are a totally different tree species. And then there's what we would consider like a European olive, the kind in Italy. And only the European olive, the one in Italy, likely is susceptible. They're totally different tree families. They're actually not closely related. So in the native range of emerald ash borer, there's no European olive trees that, unless they were planted there for the sake of growing European olives. So it's complex, and it's a really good question, especially for Oregon, California, Texas, Georgia, and the rest of the olive growing parts of the United States.
Yeah, it is. Everyone is very nervous about it, and especially most of our insecticide options for EAB, for ash trees in particular, are typically not labeled for olive. And the ones that are some of the more effective ones that are not labeled for food production for olive. So it makes a extra wrinkle there.
Yeah, that's really tricky, because you would hope there would be a treatment option that is appropriate for food. So that's hard to hear, Max. So I'm glad that you shared that.
Yeah, and there are ODA's pesticide program is working or has been working diligently to educate growers. There are some options available for I forget the exact mechanism, but for using novel insecticides on an emergent pest. It's just that it is tricky, requires the pesticide producers buy-in and petitioning. And it just hasn't been done yet because EAB has not hit the areas where olive is growing. So more options may become available and come to market as it becomes more of a threat.
And the science isn't even there. We don't actually know if it would infest an olive to the point of even stunting its growth. We just know they're capable of infesting European olives.
Yes, and we know that in Cipollini's documented emergence, it did kill the main leader of a very small olive, but so they're capable of feeding, but we don't know if this is a pest where, you know, mild pruning may be able to remove enough of the beetles in olive to prevent damage. We just don't know. It's unfortunately a new wrinkle in EAB that's understudied. I see another question in the chat or a question in the Q&A from an anonymous attendee.
Yes. You want to read it?
Sure. Where are the 4 biocontrol release areas located? Are they far from treated trees? So we are keeping those sites a little close to the chest because people have unfortunately messed with some of our biocontrol release sites in the past. But they are in the infested area, well in the infested area around Forest Grove. And those sites do actually have treated trees as well at them, or some of them do. But they are actually compatible with the insecticide treatments. Our insecticide treatments are trunk injections of emamectin benzoate, which do not actually impact the parasitoids at all. The parasitoids are very picky about oviposition and need a healthy larva to lay an egg on, or to sting, and lay their eggs in. So we're not worried about the insecticide treatments having any impact on the parasitoids.
Max, I have a question then, since I don't see any new ones in the Q&A. Being that EAB is relatively new to Oregon, versus especially places in the Midwest and East, how has the public reception been? And, you know, were people anecdotally probably, but were people familiar with it? And, you know, how did they feel about learning about it and the treatments that you're doing?
Yeah, it has been a mixed bag. Some people are very aware of it and have been dreading it. Other people are just as surprised as anywhere else. A lot of the foresters and arborists that we're talking to are already very informed. Some of them have basically been, you know, waiting with bated breath for someone to detect it. Overall, I'd say it's about on par. A little bit. The public is a little more informed than your average new invasive species, but just a little bit higher than average.
Right, that makes sense. Another question here from Melissa. Are there any concerns about century trees drawing EAB farther out from existing infestation areas?
We initially, that's part of why we didn't do century trees last year, due to that concern. But because we have such a high density of our slam ring as almost a buffer, we're not worried about them jumping the slam ring. If they're going to jump the slam ring, we think they're going to jump the slam ring regardless. So that's where we want our century trees to draw in any of those rogue spreading beetles.
All right. Anyone else with any questions for Max while we have certainly have a couple more minutes here. Question from David says disposal of down trees chipping.
Yeah, we are using either fine chipping less than 1 inch, where possible for some of our like street trees, because the arborists who we've hired are equipped for that already. But for our slam trees, we actually are using an air curtain incinerator. which we have within ODA to incinerate the trees, especially the larger trees that can't be chipped.
Okay. Next question from Melissa. Linking EAB infestations to baseball might interest people to know ash may be gone one day.
Absolutely. That is always a good link. People don't realize how much ash is used in their everyday tools and products.
Yeah, and I've seen some good articles out there about that. And then from David, can you please share outreach materials with us as we are placing EAB traps in Northern California?
Absolutely. David, I will, if you want to send me an email, my email should still be up on the screen. I can send you a bunch of our EAB info and outreach materials. And I'll throw the link in the chat as well.
Yeah.
To our this is just our general survey webpage. So there's all manner of flyers in English and Spanish, including brochures and whatnot. But if you don't see it there, or on the Oregon Department of Forestry website, which yeah, we can see if we have it. And
awesome. Yeah, Max, it looks like you sent it to just Lee and I, but then Lee copied it to everyone. So that should be in the chat for anyone to access.
Thank you very
Said,
much.
thank you. Yep. And on the outreach front too, since I don't see any more questions, I'll just take this moment to say, Lee and I are really excited. We are about to start a project in Region 6, which is Oregon and Washington, on the outreach front. And so we're going to be doing kind of a real deep dive into all of the online locations across all of the agencies and all of the tribal nations that will work with us, and all of the, regional websites and cities, and literally any place that we can find websites that it makes sense to have firewood outreach, campground entities, RV organizations, like anyone and everyone who will work with us. We're going to be doing an outreach strategy for them and getting messaging out there to have a more preventative approach and like raise awareness on this issue, but also kind of reach people in the planning stages of their, camping trips and other activities in which they're likely to be using firewood. So that's something we're excited about.
And Max mentioned at the beginning of his presentation, which was great, with that Oregon was really proactive in putting together a task force and then subcommittees. And Laurel and I are working specifically with Oregon's communications subcommittee to start figuring out how our actions can be aligned with theirs, so that our project is basically part of that structure for the Oregon actions. In Washington, it'll be different. But it's a great example of how the structure that Oregon is built around emerald ash borer response is flexible. So for instance, we as the Don't Move Firewood campaign can integrate our efforts into it, which I really appreciate. And so I thought I'd give a shout out to that structure that Max had mentioned at the start.
Yeah, thank you all so much. There is so much work to do that there is no time for us to duplicate effort.
Yeah.
So let's, and I just want to throw another quick plug to another invasive pest that we're working on, Mediterranean oak borer. Just because it's not ash wood doesn't mean you can move it. Don't move any firewood. There's probably something in there that you don't want to move.
Yeah. That's a great point.
Yeah. And emerald ash borer week, we focused so much on emerald ash borer that we tend to forget about the absolute importance of other pests that are less well recognized, like Mediterranean oak borer found in Oregon and Oregon and California, as well as many, many other forest pests. So I'm glad you brought that up.
All right, well, that's the hour. So thank you again to Max and Oregon Department of Agriculture for contributing to EAB Week, and to all of our attendees, and hope everyone takes care. The recording will be available probably the next day or two, along with all of our other webinars. So thank you, everyone, and have a good day.